Okay, so next talk is given by Emma Hurst. While Emma has been officially campaigning for animal welfare for over 15 years, first working as a campaign director for Animal Liberation and later as a media officer at PETA, she has actually fought on behalf of animals since primary school. Born and raised in Sydney, Emma traces her passion for animal protection back to her childhood when she was cradling a hen, and realising the hen purred in the same way as her cat, Emma decided she could no longer eat meat and made it her life goal to fight on behalf of those who are voiceless. So to date, Emma has run a number of highly successful campaigns that saw 2 major duck producers successfully prosecuted by the ACCC, the end of various cruel wild goat racing events, multiple companies, including major burger chains and butchers, ceased their sales of rabbit meat, and hundreds of animals released from medical research. In 2019, she was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council as the first female member of Parliament elected to represent the Animal Justice Party. She now chairs the Selected Committee on the use of battery cages for hens in the egg production industry. When she's not campaigning on behalf of animals, Emma continues to challenge herself, competing as a plant-based bodybuilder and long-distance runner. Emma is also a qualified psychologist, having received her Masters in Psychology from Monash University, and is in training to which she attributes her strong analytic and communication skills and the ability to empathise with the plight of animals. Everyone, please welcome Emma.
Hello, thank you for that. I thought I'd start off by just telling you all how I ended up in politics. Obviously, with a background in psychology, it seems like a rather different jump in careers. I decided to study psychology when I decided that I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to protecting animals. And I realised a lot of people were trying to push me into veterinary science, a lot of people were trying to push me into studying animal behaviour therapy. And I realised that it wasn't animals that needed to change, that animal cruelty is people-caused, and therefore there needs to be a people-based solution. So I studied psychology, I worked in various different clinical settings, I worked in research settings, but my passion was to work for animal charities. So I've worked, as was mentioned, at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, I worked for World Animal Protection International, and I worked for Animal Liberation, and predominantly my work there was in campaigning for individual behaviour change and also corporate behaviour change. So the way I see it, there are 3 core areas of change that we need to help deliver animal protection, and that is convincing people to change their own individual behaviours, convincing corporates to make changes within their ethics and their practices, and convincing legislative change as well. And we need a balance of all 3 to really see good progress. And we're seeing huge progress in individual and corporate change. We've heard from Animals Australia just before, and you would have seen their amazing work in the battery caged area, seeing corporations making commitments to phase out the use of caged eggs, for example, by 2025. My work at Animal Liberation, we worked with Qantas and Origin Energy to stop funding wild goat racing events, which were exceptionally cruel. And we also did a lot on individual change. So we're now the 3rd fastest growing vegan market in the world. And we're seeing huge changes in both of those areas. So when I actually stopped and asked myself, where am I best placed to work in animal protection, the area that I saw falling behind was in legislative change. So once Voiceless, the animal protection organisation, came about, what we saw was a huge push in law subjects, and people started to take more and more attention towards legislative change to protect animals. However, it wasn't happening so much actually within Parliament, where we could actually see some good legislative change that was protecting animals. So the Animal Justice Party was formed, and we're one of the fastest growing political parties. It's almost unprecedented how fast we grew as a minor party. Most minor parties run for several elections before they get anybody elected. The first time we ran in an election in New South Wales, we had Mark Pearson elected. The second Victorian state election that the Animal Justice Party ran in, we got Andy Medic, who was our second MP for the Animal Justice Party, and then we just ran again in New South Wales, and in March I was the third MP elected to the Animal Justice Party. So now that we are 3 strong, I think that a lot of political parties, and in fact they actually came and knocked on my door and told me that they were wondering if we were going to be just a one-hit wonder and that we would sort of disappear. But I think now that we've got 3 MPs, they realise that there was this desperate need from the community to have voices for animals in Parliament and to help get legislative change. So we've really sort of come front and centre, and people are realising that we're there to stay. So once I was elected, Mark and I sat down, and we have 2 staff members each. So our team sat down with our state office, and we spent 3 days. We locked ourselves into a room, and we put every single animal issue that we could think of on post-it notes and stuck them all around the room. So everything from cane toads to climate change to batcher cage rabbit meat farming to batcher cage hen farming to feedlots, everything that we could possibly think of that we needed to campaign on and we needed to get change on. So we absolutely filled the walls. And then we assessed every single post-it note and every single issue under 3 categories. And you may have heard of these categories if you've already looked a little bit into effective altruism. But our 3 categories were scale, so how many animals are affected by this particular issue, and if there was change in that issue, how many animals would it either save or change their lives? And they're 2 different things, obviously, if you're looking at a welfare campaign compared to an animal rights campaign. We looked at tractability, so how hard or easy is it going to be to get progress in that area? How popular is it, and how well known is it? And neglectedness. And neglectedness was quite a different one coming at it from a legislative perspective compared to when we were working in advocacy. Mark and I used to both work for animal liberation, so we'd both come from an advocacy background. But when we worked in advocacy, sometimes you look at neglectedness and you say, well, we need to run a campaign on this. But now that we're in legislation and we're in Parliament, we're less looking at what is neglected, because we don't have the time and the resources to run strong campaigns. That's not our focus anymore. We almost need to look at campaigns that aren't neglected, that have already been out there, so that we can push for legislative change based on the back of what other advocacy groups have already pushed out there. So once we scaled every single one of those issues, we came up with a few priority areas. And I'm just going to go through a couple of those priority areas and explain how it fits into those 3. So the first priority area for us was battery hens. So when we look at scale, we're looking at about 12 million hens in batcher cages right across Australia. And this was an opportunity to run state campaign and legislation that would have national scale. So at the moment, we're going through a standards and guidelines process from a national perspective around the use of cages in the battery cage egg industry. So in the past, when people have worked in the advocacy space and campaigned to end cages, the big block that's always and consistently come up for advocacy groups is, if we ban the use of cages in this state or in this territory, then retailers will just ship in caged eggs from other states and territories, and that would be an unfair disadvantage for any of the farmers in our state and territory. So now that there is a national process, we're looking at trying to get every state and territory to do the same thing at once. The feedback that we have is that, well, the ACT has already banned it. Quite a few of the states and territories are either for banning it or open to banning it, depending on what New South Wales does. So everything actually falls back to here. Most of the battery-caged egg farmers are in New South Wales, and we've got another big block in the fact that the head of the National Party here in New South Wales is a battery-caged egg farmer. And we've also got a Liberal national government, obviously. So we've got some pretty big hurdles. So we knew that we needed to create a big pressure point here in New South Wales if we were going to get a national process to ban battery cages. When we looked at how neglected the area was, we realised it's not neglected. There's a lot of campaigns and a lot of groups that have been advocating in this space for a very long time. But what we did identify is that there is a really strong compassion fatigue in this particular area. So people either thought that cages were already gone, or when you mentioned it, people were exhausted from hearing from it and couldn't believe that it was still happening. So we knew we had to run a campaign that would reinvigorate people and give people hope that this really is the opportunity to change, because once this standard and guidelines process goes through, it will be some time again before we can see this legislation revisited. And if we don't see a ban in battery cages in New South Wales and across nationally, it will then fall back onto advocacy groups to continue that campaigning for individual and corporate change. And so we will get there eventually, but it would be lovely if we got that sort of legislative change confirmed so that that was a more solid win, I guess, for the animals. So once we decided that this was going to be one of our priority areas, we worked to get an inquiry up in the upper house. So we had to get the numbers, and we've got a really interesting makeup, I guess, of the upper house at the moment. So the government, for any of their own legislation, they've got the numbers in the lower house, and then it comes to our house, the upper house, to review. For them to get any legislation passed, they would have to get the vote of Fred Nile from the Christian Democrats, One Nation, and the Shooters and Fishers to get any of their legislation through. And I'm not sure that the government really wants to run their agendas on a constant basis either. So that puts us in a really interesting place. The government can also come to us, or the Greens, and I think they're still trying to work out who it is that they do want to work with. They're sort of knocking on everybody's doors at the moment, trying to get various bits of legislation spoken about. When we wanted to get this inquiry up, the government did not want us to run an inquiry into the battery caged egg industry because they wanted to be able to freely make whatever decision they make when they go to the ag meeting, which I believe is now in March next year. When we run an inquiry, we throw it out to get what the community thinks, what experts think, what advocacy groups think, what the industry thinks, and we create a report and we create recommendations. So the government didn't want to have that report and recommendations. They wanted to go in and just run the whole thing. So they voted against us having an inquiry. However, we got Labor, we got the Greens, we got Independent Justin Field, and we convinced One Nation to vote for the inquiry as well, and that's how we got the numbers to actually get it up. And once we got the inquiry up, we put myself in as chair, and we put it out to advocacy groups who got quite involved, and we ended up with about 14,000 submissions, which the huge majority of them were saying anywhere from we need to at least ban battery cages to the entire egg industry is cruel. So that really helps us to develop a report and to build evidence, and we ran some hearings as well, and we're now in the process of putting that report and the recommendations together for government. And that 14,000 submissions was really important to achieve because one of the things that the government argued against putting this inquiry up is that only the Animal Justice Party thinks that the community are interested in this issue, and they said the community actually aren't engaged in this issue at all and that there is no interest. And yet when we opened up for submissions, the committee's office was constantly knocking on our door saying we cannot process this number of submissions. It's just too big. So I think we proved them wrong on that at the very least. The other area that came up really strongly, and this came up during the election process as well, was the penalties and also the enforcement of the Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act. So One, our penalties. So an act of animal cruelty in New South Wales sees a maximum fine of $5,500. And my favourite figure to compare that to is the $220,000 fine that the government is pushing in through ag laws to punish somebody for exposing animal cruelty. So the person who exposes animal cruelty is looking at $220,000. The person who commits an act of cruelty is $5,500. So this is very much against what community expectations are. Community expectations are much higher in regards to acts of cruelty to animals, and New South Wales as a state has some of the lowest penalties right across Australia. Our Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act is also the only criminal legislation that we have that is enforced by a charity. And that's something that is really, really, really important. If you think about running all child protection laws by the Starlight Foundation, where they rely almost entirely on public donations to enforce that law, you start to realise how ridiculous that really is. The RSPCA gets less than 2% of their funding from the government. And when I sat down with the government, how I explained it to them was, if my neighbour was beating a dog, I would ring the RSPCA, I would expect them to come and seize that dog, I would expect them to get veterinary treatment for that dog, I would expect them to rehome that dog, and I would expect them to prosecute my neighbour for animal cruelty, but I'm not a regular donor to the RSPCA. So how on earth are they supposed to do all of that with less than 2% of their funding coming from the government? So this was something that was really highlighted. The other problem with our Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act and the RSPCA and the Animal Welfare League actually running and having control and enforcement of that act is a conflict of interest within the Department of Primary Industries. So the Department of Primary Industries signs off on those charities enforcing the act each year. And yet the Department of Primary Industry's primary focus is to make sure that the industry is viable and financial, which is often in direct conflict with animal welfare. So again, when we start to look at scale, neglectability and tractability on those issues within POCTA, this is enormous. This affects every single animal in New South Wales, everything from a companion animal to farmed animals. It's not entirely neglected. A lot of advocacy groups have been pushing for an independent Office of Animal Welfare within the department and seeing a move away from the Department of Primary Industries holding on to that and making sure, even if the RSPCA were to maintain their prosecution powers, that there was also a government-run and government-funded umbrella agency that was able to enforce the Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act. We're also seeing a lot in the media, particularly in New South Wales, about light penalties for acts of animal cruelty. We're seeing, very light fines or slaps on the wrist for really extreme cases of animal cruelty, and that has got significant media attention. It's also got a lot of tractability because this is not an issue where somebody would need to be vegan or vegetarian or wanting to have to make that individual behaviour change. Australians genuinely really love animals and they want to see animals properly protected by our laws. And it's a really an interesting one because often when we look at things from a legislative point of view, a lot of people see animal welfare issues as a left issue. However, this is one area where we've got a lot of support from the hard right and the Conservatives as well. So we set up another inquiry because at the same time the Minister for Agriculture in New South Wales is reviewing POCTA. So again, we were able to position ourselves into a review that was already happening where we can set up an inquiry, speak to advocacy groups, speak to the community, get all that information together and present that to the Minister so that we can see some change. So the inquiry is all about the enforcement side of it, and this time we're going to have it chaired by my colleague Mark Pearson, and that's going to start very, very soon. We also met with the Minister for Primary Industries, who is Adam Marshall, in respect to the penalties. And we showed him a table of the penalties from other states and territories and how far New South Wales is behind. And we did secure from him a promise that he would put in a legislative change for tougher penalties here in New South Wales. So that will either happen at the end of this year or early next year. So we won't include that in the inquiry as it goes through because we believe that there's going to be some change. I don't know at the moment what they're going to propose. I assume that they might try and copy what, for example, Victoria and the penalties from the Victorian legislation. We may push for amendments to the penalties if they're too low. But we're also going to be pushing for other amendments that we see as really important, including acts of aggravated cruelty. Someone would lose their gun licence. We would also like to see that if somebody's found guilty for an act of cruelty, that they wouldn't be able to get a working with children's check. And we also want to see mandatory psychological assessment as well, so that we can actually reduce the recidivism in this particular area as well. So in Parliament, one of the other areas that we're often working on is fighting against bad legislation that the government's putting up. And the most recent and most obvious one is all the ag-gag laws that people are pushing for. So at the moment, it looks like in New South Wales, we've got 3 that we'll be fighting against. We have a biosecurity regulation, and the Animal Justice Party has put in a disallowance motion on that regulation. It's very poorly written law as well. Essentially what this biosecurity regulation states is that if a farmer puts a sign outside of his house saying that he has a plan, he can put his phone number on it, and if anybody breaches that plan, they're looking at $220,000 fine. We got an independent barrister's advice on this particular regulation, and they said that what it allows for is secret laws, and we haven't had secret laws since World War II or something like that. Essentially, any member of the society should be able to ring up government and ask them what the laws are. Now we're allowing private citizens to write their own criminal law. The government doesn't know what is in that criminal law. And it's allowing a private citizen to write that law in any way that they see fit without any kind of legal advice or otherwise. It can be used against neighbours if there's a neighbourly dispute. It could be used against people in domestic violence situations. It could be used against somebody from Australian Post that doesn't follow the biosecurity plan. The biosecurity plan can change at any moment as well. So if you had the biosecurity plan yesterday, it could be just suddenly rewritten when you happen to come within 100 metres of a property, for example. So they're very unlikely to hold up in court, which is just an interesting sort of aside on that one. The other law that we're looking at is what's being called the right to farm law, which the public narrative that the government is pushing out is to attack vegans and to stop vegan vigilantes, is their terminology. It's actually much broader than that. It stops any peaceful protests in forestry. It stops what's called nuisance claims from neighbours. So if there's chemical drift, 1080 poison, odour issues, and you're a neighbouring property of a farm, you can no longer take a nuisance claim to court. So landowner rights of neighbouring properties are being removed and giving farmers more rights than neighbouring lands. It also is still designed to reduce the transparency from the industry, so to stop people from going on and filming. But it also attacks workers from filming as well. So when we sat down with the minister to get a briefing on this, I asked if it was going to affect workers from being able to speak out as whistleblowers. And the example I gave was from my days working at Animal Liberation. We often got called up from people, particularly actually within slaughterhouses more than anything else, where they'd been working in a slaughterhouse, they had witnessed extreme animal cruelty, they'd called the RSPCA, they'd called the DPI, they'd called the police, they'd spoken to management, and nothing was being done about it. And they would ring animal rights groups and they would say, can you please install a camera in this place because there is so much animal cruelty that's happening. So this new law that person would fall under inciting trespass. And that's an aggravated offence, and they're looking at, I think it was about 3 years jail time for even just making that call to an animal group and asking them to gather evidence from that facility. So it's also designed to silence whistleblowers as well. So it's very dangerous legislation for a variety of groups. And so we have referred that legislation to an inquiry as well, which started last week. And submissions, because it's an inquiry into legislation rather than... So the standalone inquiries that the AJP have set up into POCTA and into Battery Hens are several months, and it's something that we develop our own committee for and work on. Whereas when we're setting up an inquiry onto legislation, it's only for like 2 weeks. So if you wanted to put in a submission for that, that closes on the 1st of October. So we only get a couple of days to actually get submissions and people's thoughts in. And on Thursday next week, we have a hearing with animal advocacy groups, forestry groups, police, the Department of Primary Industries to gather evidence around this piece of legislation. The other main area that has been quite controversial that has come up recently is a push to repeal the Brumby Protection Act in New South Wales. And the reason that this has been so controversial, and it's not a black and white issue, is that the Brumbies at Kosciuszko are causing damage to the area of Kosciuszko, and it is affecting both the environment in certain areas in Kosciuszko and also the native species. However, by repealing this act, we would see quite potentially some very extremely cruel aerial culling where planes fly over and shoot at the horses. They separate families. A lot of these horses are pregnant. A lot of them have foals with them who will separate. A lot of the gunshot wounds will leave horses. I believe the research from the most recent one at Guy Fawkes was up to 4 hours after being shot before they die. So it's extremely cruel. However, Labor and the Greens and the Independent Justin Field are very heavily pushing for a repeal of this bill and to open up aerial culling of these horses. So we found ourselves in a very bizarre position working with the Liberal National Party to try to stop that repeal from happening and to find the most humane solution. From the Animal Justice Party's point of view, we do think that it's a concern that there are environmental damages being caused by these horses and to the native species. But we also believe that these horses were brought here by human beings, and it's our responsibility, if we're going to reduce the number of horses, that we find the most humane way possible to do so. So we've been meeting with the Minister for Environment around immunocontraceptive darting, and we've been working with some scientists, and one of the scientists has just recently come back from the US where they have been studying immunocontraceptive darting for about the last 15 years. And the science, even in areas with rough terrain like Kosciuszko, it's coming back very positive. We're seeing a 90% reduction in foaling rate for these horses. And they're not able to reproduce, so their numbers are genuinely reducing. We have tried to meet with Labor and the Greens and with the Invasive Species Council to push for immunocontraceptives, but immunocontraceptives actually just severely reduce the numbers of animals. There's no evidence that it will actually completely eradicate the horses in that area, and these groups want to see horses eradicated entirely from the area. The problem with eradicating horses entirely from the area is that we don't know what the flow-on effect of that will be. There's no research, because the horses have been there now for a few hundred years, and so ecosystems change, and once you remove one animal, we know that there are a whole lot of other non-native animals in that area, and we don't know what the effect of that will be. Will we suddenly see this explosion of some non-native frog or some other animal where that hasn't been taken into account? So there's no science, nobody's researched what would happen if we eradicated horses entirely. So we continue to work on that. So far the bill has not been repealed. The shooters and fishers support the repeal, no surprises there. but One Nation at the moment are also with the government and with the coalition. So hopefully we've got the numbers to stop that repeal. So a lot of our strategy, interestingly, because we've got a Liberal national government, relies on us being able to convince the hard right. So that means that as the Animal Justice Party, we have to actually work with people who we, probably don't see eye to eye on most other issues. But a lot of the hard right, the Liberals, the Nationals, and One Nation even don't have very strong policies around animal welfare, and so they're quite open to sitting down at the table and discussing things. We're also moving ourselves into areas that are already having influence, so areas that are already moving, so the Brumby issue, the Proctor Review and the egg standards and guidelines, so making sure we have influence on areas that are already, that the government are already working in, and also building new narratives from within inside Parliament, so ensuring both sides are being heard, creating hope, and positioning the humane solution front and centre of all of government policy. We've actually just recently got another inquiry up. My staff member said to me the other day, I hope that we don't set ourselves up to be the inquiry party, because I don't think any of the other political parties are getting quite as many inquiries up as us. But I think when I came in, what I realised is a lot of the other politicians don't understand the issues, and they're very nervous about working on animal issues, particularly after what happened in New South Wales with the greyhound racing industry. When I sat down with quite a few of the Liberal politicians, they said, we don't want to touch animal welfare because we'll all lose our jobs, like with what happened with greyhound racing. So the inquiry process is really an important process to be able to say, look, this is what the community thinks, this is what the industry is saying, and this is where we can find some gaps of change. And even some areas of compromise where it's safe for you to legislate and nobody's going to lose their jobs. So the inquiry that we have just set up, which again will open again for public submissions fairly shortly, is the use of exotic animals in circuses and dolphins in entertainment as well. So we're hoping to set that up, and that one will conclude in June next year. So I thought I'd spend the rest of the time, if we've got some time, just opening up to questions, and happy to hear from you guys.
Thanks very much, Emma. We've got a question from the audience. So, do you think that we will encounter legislative issues when lab-grown meat enters the market and competes with the meat industry?
Yeah, I actually met last week with the first lab-grown meat company in Australia, who are in New South Wales. They're actually based in Parramatta. They're called VOW, V-O-W. And they've got like a really interesting process on how they're sort of setting up their company. They're working with Meat and Livestock Australia, and they're positioning themselves as an alternative rather than a takeover. And I think that's probably a really good way for them to come in. And when I sat down with them, we were more just sort of nutting out kind of what sort of legislative issues that they've come across already, and what legislative issues are likely to come up. It was quite interesting because they wanted to be as ethical as they possibly could be. And so they decided they were going to go and buy a pig from the sale yard, and they had a sanctuary for this pig. And when they were going to get the pig desexed, they wanted the vet to take the cells at that point, so that they could take the cells back, and then they could always have those cells to be able to produce that lab-grown meat. But that then fell under the animal research legislation, which meant that they would have to get ethics approval, which meant that they're looking at $6,000 to get an ethics committee, 6 months for them to look through it and to give that approval. So, we kind of nutted out what the problems were there. I think we're also going to have some labelling issues that would come up. I think that there'll be a push for that everything has to be clearly labelled. And one thing I was concerned on for the lab-grown meat was that there would be a push to have it labelled as genetically modified. But speaking with Val, they said that there are actually ways that they can do it where it's not actually genetically modified and it doesn't fall under that category. So it would probably just say lab-grown meat. But I don't think that from what they explained to me, it doesn't sound like their business model will be affected by that because it would already be obviously lab-grown meat. Some of the products that they're planning on selling will be like sleep meat, where they get different bits of flesh from animals that are high in tryptophan, for example, which helps people get to sleep. And so they're actually going to be combining strains of flesh to grow. It's sort of such a bizarre thing to talk about because I couldn't imagine eating it. So they're kind of pulling different flavours together to build like a brand new meat. So they're going to be selling it as something quite different anyway. So yeah.
Great. What are some ways you would recommend individuals and general members of the public can get involved and to support the AJP?
We have... So our state office has regional groups, and that's probably the best way to reach out and get involved. There's also the youth wing, who I believe are wandering around a bit today. So the regional groups, there's one, for example, in the Inner West, there's one in Northwest Sydney, there's the Central Coast group, there's a new group in Illawarra, so there's quite a few different regional groups. So if you contact the state office and find your closest regional group, everybody's welcome. And I think that they meet once a month or something like that, so that would probably be a first step.
Which of the range of issues that you discussed relevant to animal rights do you think we could get most traction on in the near term?
I'm hoping that we're going to get some real traction on the battery caged eggs. I think it's still going to be really difficult. I think we've got about a 50% chance of seeing some change there. I think that the report from all the evidence that we heard will come back favourably, but whether or not we get a massive pushback from the Liberal National Government is not clear yet. I think this review of POCTA is going to be enormous. So when I spoke with the Minister, he's wanting to collapse the Research Act, the Exhibited Animals Act and POCTA together, and that will all finish about 2021. So we're going to have our inquiry, that's going to feed back into it. We're going to have the changes in penalties, but then the entire Act is going to be pulled apart and reviewed for New South Wales. And I think that's going to be a process of about 16 months or something like that. So it's a massive project. I mean, that's the entire Cruelty to Animals Act. And so that's going to be a huge amount of work for us because, you know, we've got all these exemptions for acts of animal cruelty to animals in farming industries. So I think that we'll hopefully be able to see a whole lot of changes there, particularly community awareness around some of the laws that allow acts of animal cruelty to continue.
So that's all the time that we've got for questions. Big thanks to Emma Hurst and for all the wonderful work you do for the AJP.